Some secrets are more dangerous than any weapon, yet they lie hidden in plain sight. Tonight, we follow a trail that begins with a locked drawer, stolen letters, and a respected bank manager whose ambition conceals a darker design. In this tale of deception, intellect meets human frailty, and every detail, from a faint ash to a silver cufflink, unveils a hidden motive. Where are you tuning in from, and what time is it? Let me know in the comments. And so we step quietly into Baker Street, where reason and revelation await at every turn. It was on one of those rare evenings when the atmosphere of Baker Street seemed wholly serene, and I found myself indulging in the luxury of quiet reflection. The lamps had been lit, their mellow glow softened by the London fog that pressed against the panes, and the fire burned with a steady cheerfulness that invited repose. Holmes had been silent for some time, and I, relieved of my medical duties for the day, reached for my journal with the comfortable sense that no intrusion was likely to disturb my pen. There is, I confess, a peculiar charm in recording those impressions of life with Holmes which, though they may not always involve adventure, serve to illuminate his extraordinary character. I had intended, therefore, to devote a few lines to the peaceful domesticity of the moment, the well-ordered chaos of newspapers upon the rug, the faint aroma of tobacco lingering in the curtains, and the peculiar blend of silence and vitality that ever marked our shared lodgings. In such an hour, I might almost have believed my companion a mere mortal, subject to the same ennui as other men, rather than that machine-like reasoner who astonished the world. Yet, even as I set down these words, I recall a vague unease beneath the calm. It was the deceptive quiet of the sea before the storm, the sort of pause that seems to hover on the brink of new disturbance. My pen, as it traced the pages of my journal, lingered over recollections of our most recent inquiries. How vivid in my memory were the tangled threads of those affairs, the cryptic cipher that had once baffled the Yard, the ingenious contrivance of the masked visitor, and the bitter drama played out, feverish excitement and comparative monotony, each accentuating the other, until the most trivial occurrence might kindle expectation. It was as though Providence itself had elected to grant us a brief repose, but I knew my friend too well to believe such tranquility could last. Holmes sat opposite me in his armchair, his long, lean figure draped with an ease that belied the intensity within. Between his fingers glowed the familiar black clay pipe, from which he drew steady whirls of smoke that curled like ghostly figures about the mantelpiece. His eyes, half closed beneath heavy lids, fixed themselves now upon the fire, now upon some invisible detail in the room, as though his mind roved far beyond the confines of our quarters. At intervals, he would lean forward to adjust a note upon his violin, plucking a string here, tightening a peg there, yet never raising the bow to produce more than a fragment of sound. It was his way, when starved of problems, to turn restlessly from one occupation to another, his spirit ill at ease without a puzzle upon which to fasten. Once he startled me by remarking, apropos of nothing, that our neighbour across the way had recently altered his occupation, deducing, with the ease of a conjurer, from the mud upon his boots and the wear upon his cuffs, that the man had abandoned clerical work for something more mechanical. Such sudden sallies of observation, though brilliant, carried with them a note of dissatisfaction. For Holmes, to detect a change in a stranger's profession was as paltry a morsel as a single crumb to a starving man. He required a feast, and London, for the moment, seemed unwilling to provide it. I had just noted in my journal the curious duality of his genius, that it made him both the most formidable of reasoners and the most restless of companions, when the stillness of the evening was abruptly broken.
From the stair below came the unmistakable sound of hurried steps, steps that faltered,
resumed, and then mounted with an urgency that set my nerves tingling. I laid down my pen as the tread grew nearer, and Holmes, without altering his posture, turned his head slightly toward the door, his features sharpening as a hound pricks its ears to an approaching cry. A knock, rapid and insistent, rattled the panels, and in that instant the atmosphere of calm dissolved as though it had never been. Holmes set aside his pipe, his eyes alight with that peculiar flame I knew so well, and he called for the visitor to enter. I closed my journal hastily, aware that its pages were about to yield to a living drama far more compelling than my recollections. The door opened, and upon the threshold stood a figure whose anxious aspect proclaimed at once that the serenity of Baker Street had come to its abrupt conclusion. There are few sights more telling to a physician's eye than that of a man oppressed by inward anxiety. The figure who crossed our threshold that night bore all the signs of nervous agitation. His pale cheeks glistened faintly with the perspiration of exertion. His lips quivered, as though unused to speech, and his hands, long and bony, clutched at his hat as if it were the one object binding him to composure. His attire, though respectable, betrayed disorder. His cravat was awry. His boots had not been brushed since the morning, and the knees of his trousers were dusted with the chalk of London's pavements. Watson the doctor observed a heartbeat quickened by fear. Watson the man of letters noted the uneasy glances darted about our sitting room, but Watson the companion of Sherlock Holmes recognized at once the advent of a new case. For the stranger's eyes, wide and restless, had in them that peculiar expression which I had so often seen in our visitors, a mixture of dread and desperate hope, as though only my friend's uncanny genius might restore order to their troubled lives. The man cleared his throat, attempted a word, and failed. It was evident that his courage was balanced precariously upon the verge of collapse, and it was Holmes, with his habitual courtesy, who came to his rescue. "My dear sir," said Holmes, indicating the chair opposite him, "pray compose yourself. You are a bank clerk of some responsibility, recently promoted, yet still of a chess master who has opened with a familiar gambit. It is not sorcery, sir, but observation," he continued. "The inkstain upon your cuff tells me of your profession. The authority in your bearing, coupled with the nervous clutch upon your hat, suggests responsibility recently gained and not yet fully secured, while the papers protruding from your pocket are docketed in a banker's hand. As for your errand, your agitation speaks of a crisis in which your own reputation is not the only stake." The man bowed his head, defeated yet relieved, and I marvelled anew at how a few stray details, which to my eye were but specks upon a canvas, became in Holmes's hands the outlines of an entire portrait. "My name," said the visitor at last, steadying his voice with visible effort, "is Percival Trent, clerk to the City and Provincial Bank. I come not for myself, but for one whose good name must at all hazards be preserved. A drawer, sir, a locked drawer, has been opened, its contents tampered with, and if what was within should fall into the wrong hands, a scandal of the gravest nature will surely ensue." He broke off, his hands trembling once more, and glanced toward the door, as if fearful that even its stout panels could not guard his secret. Holmes leaned forward, his keen eyes fixed upon the clerk's face, and in that moment I felt the atmosphere of the room shift palpably. For here, in the tremor of a nervous voice and the hint of a stolen paper, lay the beginning of a mystery that promised to tax even Sherlock Holmes's powers to their utmost. The man who now sat before us could scarcely be said to command his faculties, so shaken was he by inward agitation. His pale countenance, lined though he could not have been more than 35, bore the stamp of sleeplessness, and his lips worked convulsively as he strove to frame his opening words. The nervous energy of his hands was remarkable. They twisted the brim of his felt hat until I feared it would be torn asunder, and his fingers, long and ink-stained, tapped ceaselessly upon his knee, as though compelled by some inner metronome of unease. His eyes, shifting from Holmes to myself and back again, had the wide and startled aspect of a creature cornered, uncertain whether to flee or plead for mercy. I, who had often witnessed men under the strain of battle, recognized at once that his distress was not born of physical peril, but of that subtler, more corrosive dread which springs from conscience and responsibility. Holmes regarded him with that composed detachment which was his habit, his long fingers steepled together, his gaze calm but penetrating. It was evident that my friend had already drawn his preliminary conclusions, while I, moved by compassion, could only wonder what terror had driven this man to our rooms at so late an hour. At length, the stranger found his voice. "My name," he said with effort, "is Percival Trent. I hold a clerkship at the City and Provincial Bank in Lombard Street. It is not in my nature to seek advice from strangers, but circumstances have forced me to your door." His tone faltered, as though the confession were in itself a humiliation. I observed that, though his attire was respectable, it bore the stamp of one who lived just beyond his means. The cloth was fine, but frayed at the cuffs, and his watch chain, though polished, was brass beneath its gilt. Such details suggested to my eye a man of the lower middle class, educated and ambitious, striving ever upwards, yet painfully aware of the distance between his station and that of his employers. Holmes inclined his head in a gesture of encouragement, but his eyes never left the man's restless hands. "Pray proceed, Mr. Trent," he said quietly. "Your appearance here speaks of urgency, and time, you will agree, is seldom a friend to the anxious."
The lock. The mechanism appeared as sound as ever, yet the drawer was open, its contents disturbed. No clerk, no messenger, no intruder could have accomplished it without leaving some trace. And yet it was done. I could not repress a start of astonishment at this singular detail. To my unimaginative mind, a drawer either yielded to key or to violence, but here was one that had apparently surrendered without either. Holmes's eyes gleamed, and he leaned back, tapping his fingers against one another with slow precision. "You interest me exceedingly, Mr. Trent," he murmured. Trent's voice dropped further, so that I was compelled to lean closer to catch his words. "Within that drawer, gentlemen, were letters, private letters, entrusted to the bank for safe custody by a lady of high position. They are gone. If they were to be made public, the consequences would be irreparable." He paused, overcome by the gravity of his own statement. "Of what nature are these letters?" Holmes asked, his tone deceptively mild. "They touch," replied Trent, "upon matters of a personal history, which, if revealed, would compromise the honour of Lady Eveline Dorset." At the mention of the name, even I, no frequenter of drawing-room gossip, recognized its import. For Lady Eveline's beauty and her charitable works were often recorded in the columns of the society press. Holmes's expression did not alter, but I perceived the faint tightening at the corners of his mouth, which told me that the case had assumed, in his eyes, a very singular importance. "You have done wisely to come to me, Mr. Trent," said he at last. "But mark me well. This matter requires discretion of the highest order. You may be assured that, whatever the peril, it shall not be met with indifference in Baker Street." Holmes, who had hitherto listened with half-closed eyes, now leaned forward with the air of a man examining a rare specimen. "Pray, Mr. Trent," said he, "at what hour was this discovery made?" "It was shortly after 10 in the morning, sir, when the clerks assembled for duty, and the office of Mr. Harwood, the manager, is situated where in relation to the counting-house?" "At the rear, Mr. Holmes, beyond a glass partition. The drawer stands beneath his private desk." Holmes nodded gravely. "And you, I think, are entrusted with the morning inspection of the ledgers." The astonishment upon Trent's face was almost comical. "Why, yes. It falls to me to review the entries before the day's transactions begin."
You arrived first, then. Indeed, I found the drawer as I have described. Holmes steepled his fingers, his gaze fixed upon some inner calculation. You observed no disorder upon the desk, no unusual scent in the room, no trace of soil upon the carpet. Trent shook his head, bewildered by the precision of the inquiries. I, who had grown familiar with my friend's method, could tell that he was mapping the scene, as though it were spread before him, each answer filling another corner of the canvas. There was a pause, during which our visitor appeared to wrestle with himself. His lips trembled. His eyes sought the floor. At last, in a voice scarcely above a whisper, he said, "The letters, sir, if they are used against her, would blast the name of Lady Evelyn Dorset." The sound of that distinguished name seemed to linger in the room like a tolling bell. I knew enough of society to recall the lady's beauty, her charitable engagements, and her unblemished reputation in the public prints. That such a figure should be vulnerable to scandal struck me with genuine pity. Holmes betrayed no surprise, yet I detected in his tightened expression the recognition that the matter had assumed a graver complexion. "Society, Dr. Watson," he once observed, "is built less upon virtue than upon appearances. When those appearances are endangered, the edifice totters." Those words returned to me now with sombre force. Mr. Trent clasped his hands together until the knuckles showed white. "Mr. Holmes," he cried, "you see the position in which I stand. Should it become known that I revealed the loss, my career is ended. Should the scandal break upon Lady Evelyn, her very name will be dragged through the mire. I implore you, sir, to act with secrecy, to move with such—" Resumed his habitual station in the armchair by the fire, his lean figure draped with careless ease. Yet every line of his body suggested a latent energy, awaiting but the spark of challenge. Between his long fingers rested the familiar black clay pipe, from which curled slow wreaths of smoke that drifted lazily toward the ceiling. To a casual eye, he might have seemed sunk in indolence, yet I knew those keen grey eyes of his, fixed upon Mr. Trent, were cataloguing every twitch of muscle and every speck of dust upon the man's person. There was an air of quiet inevitability about my friend on such occasions. Visitors might suppose themselves in command of their tale, yet before the first word was spoken, Holmes had already stripped them bare of their most private habits and history. It was, indeed, as though the armchair were his throne, the pipe his sceptre, and his gaze the tribunal before which all must stand revealed. Mr. Trent, shifting uneasily beneath that scrutiny, clutched his hat more tightly, his eyes darting toward me as though seeking an ally. I could offer him none, for I too awaited with a mixture of awe and curiosity the deductions that would presently fall from Holmes's lips. "It is not merely anxiety which troubles you, Mr. Trent," Holmes began, his tone calm yet incisive. "It is guilt of a sort, not of crime, but of omission. You are a man who prides himself upon his punctuality, yet twice within the past week you have been late to your post. Am I correct?" Trent started violently. How could you know that?" "Your boots, sir. The edges are still flecked with dried clay from Hampstead Heath. A man must rise earlier than 6 to take such a walk, and yet be at his desk by 9. That you failed on 2 occasions is shown by the uneven wear on your right heel, a mark of hurried walking which has since worn smooth. Anxiety drives you into the open air, does it not?" The poor fellow gasped, his astonishment rendering him momentarily speechless. I confess I too had failed to note these minute indications. "And further," Holmes continued, "your left cuff betrays a streak of violet ink. Not your usual office supply, but of a variety used in private correspondence. You have, I surmise, been copying out a letter of great delicacy, one not intended for the ledgers of the bank." Trent bowed his head. "It is true," he murmured, I feared to speak of it. I could not withhold an exclamation of admiration. To transform a scuff, a stain, and a pair of boots into such revelations seemed to me nothing less than wizardry. Yet Holmes remained as unmoved as if he had recited a weather report. "Let us come to the kernel of the matter," said Holmes briskly. "You have with you, I think, a specimen of the documents in question." With palpable reluctance, Trent drew from his breast pocket a long envelope, somewhat crumpled, its flap worn from much opening and closing. He held it as one might a serpent, fearful alike of its loss or its retention. Holmes took it delicately between thumb and forefinger, laying it flat upon his knee. His eyes travelled over its surface as though it were a map, noting the creases, the faint stains at the corner, and the flourishes of the hand upon its face. Not a sound disturbed the room, save the crackle of the fire and the faint rasp of the envelope beneath Holmes's nail as he turned it this way and that. "This has been carried," he remarked, "not in a desk but in a pocket, and by more than one hand. Observe the double line of wear upon the fold. And the handwriting. Ah, a lady's, assuredly, but disguised with a firmness that ill accords with the feminine character. The slant betrays a tremor at the close of each word. Fear guided this pen, not affection." Trent shifted uneasily. "It is true, sir," he said. "The letters are written by Lady Evelyn herself. He broke off, biting his lip. Holmes raised a finger. "Spare us the particulars, Mr. Trent. The fewer who know their contents, the safer they remain. What concerns us now is not what is written, but what has been done." With that, he laid the envelope upon the small side table, drew his lens from his pocket, and bent over the paper with the... Within, at the corner, he traced with his nail a faint smudge. The pressure of a thumb, greasy with pomade. A clerk, you would say. No. A man who takes pride in his grooming, one whose toilette is as exact as his schemes. Trent uttered a groan, half admiration, half despair. For myself, I was once more astonished at how Holmes, from what seemed to me the barren surface of a worn envelope, could conjure an image of the thief as though the man stood bodily before us. Holmes replaced the envelope with a care that was almost reverent. "You see, Watson, the theft was no haphazard business, but the calculated act of one who both fears exposure and intends to wield it as a weapon. We deal not with a common burglar, but with a blackmailer." The words hung in the air like a sentence pronounced. I felt the shadow of scandal deepen about us, while Holmes's eyes glimmered with that fierce delight which only the scent of a true adversary could awaken in him. It must be confessed that, for all the years I had spent at Holmes's side, I was no nearer to acquiring the mysterious faculty by which he wrung truth from trifles. As I looked upon the worn envelope, I saw nothing but a piece of paper, creased and sullied as any letter might be from much handling. Yet to Holmes it was a veritable confession, every smudge a syllable, each crease a line in the handwriting of crime. I felt in that moment the old familiar sense of bewilderment that had so often overtaken me in his presence, the mixture of admiration and humiliation that springs from watching genius at play. To me the envelope was mute. To him it spoke in clear, if secret, accents. How often had I envied that penetrating vision which pierced appearances as easily as light through glass. And yet, though I could not follow the steps by which he reached his conclusions, I had learned to trust them as one trusts the compass at sea. Still, the gulf between his perception and my own weighed heavily upon me, and I resolved, as ever, to record both my ignorance and his brilliance faithfully in my journal. Holmes at last set down the envelope with a quiet finality. "There is nothing here," he remarked, "that points to chance. We are in the presence of design, cold, deliberate design. Consider, Watson. A drawer reputed impregnable is opened without violence. An envelope entrusted to secrecy is carried abroad, and upon it are the marks of a hand accustomed to luxury, not poverty. Such a combination speaks not of petty theft, but of blackmail." Mr. Trent uttered a faint exclamation, as though the word itself were poison. "Blackmail," he repeated hoarsely. "Assuredly," said Holmes. "These letters were not taken to be destroyed.
but to be used as weapons. The ash, the pomade, the altered ink. Each detail points to calculation, not impulse. We are not dealing with a starving clerk snatching at lucre, but with a strategist, one who knows the worth of fear and intends to profit by it. Holmes's eyes gleamed with that peculiar light which spoke of his mind grappling joyfully with danger. It is always a grave affair when society's idols are threatened, Watson. For men may lose fortunes and endure the loss, but reputations, those are treasures for which even the strongest will beg and bargain. At this, Mr. Trent buried his face in his hands, overcome by the grim accuracy of Holmes's words. Holmes rose and placed a hand, light yet firm, upon the clerk's trembling shoulder. Courage, Mr. Trent. You have done wisely in coming here, but you must now resign yourself to complete frankness. Every fact you conceal, however trifling, is a nail driven into the coffin of Lady Evelyn's honour. Trust me wholly, or do not trust me at all. Trent lifted his head with an effort, his lips pale but resolute. You shall know all, sir. I place myself, and the lady's good name, in your hands. Good, said Holmes. He turned to me with a faint smile. Watson, I foresee that our quiet— I knew well that my companion's mind was far removed from such common scenes. Holmes strode beside me with that peculiar energy which possessed him when his faculties were fully engaged. His keen eyes took in the movement of the traffic, the jostling of clerks, and the rattle of hansom cabs. Yet I could tell that his thoughts circled ever back to the puzzle of the bank drawer. Once he muttered, half to himself, "A key, Watson, or the illusion of a key, that is the crux." Then, seeing my questioning glance, he relapsed into silence, his long strides quickening as if to match the urgency of the case. To my mind, the journey was weighted with expectation. I had often accompanied Holmes on such expeditions, knowing that beneath the commonplace exteriors of London institutions lurk dramas of greed, fear, and betrayal. The city that morning seemed a stage, and we were about to pass behind its painted scenery. The City and Provincial Bank stood in Lombard Street with the quiet dignity of a fortress built for gold. Its portico of stone columns and massive iron doors proclaimed solidity and permanence. Yet, to my imagination, that very grandeur seemed to mock the frailty of the secret it now sheltered. The building loomed against the sky like a citadel, but within, a single drawer had betrayed its trust. Holmes halted for a moment upon the threshold, his eyes moving over the facade with the same deliberate scrutiny he had bestowed upon the envelope the night before. "A temple of finance, Watson," he murmured, "and like many temples, not without its idols and its sacrifices." We entered through swinging doors into the lofty counting house, where clerks bent over their ledgers in an atmosphere hushed save for the scratching of pens and the occasional rustle of paper. The air was heavy with the odour of ink and sealing wax, and yet beneath that prosaic perfume, I fancied I detected the sharper tang of anxiety. Each head turned as we passed, and I felt the covert glances that followed us with a curiosity not unmingled with dread. Mr. Trent, who had conducted us, spoke a word to the nearest clerk, and immediately a message was dispatched. Presently a door at the far end opened, and we were ushered into the private office of Mr. Harwood, the manager. The room was panelled in dark oak, lined with ledgers whose spines bore the patina of years, and dominated by a massive desk that seemed an altar to commerce. The manager himself rose to greet us, a tall man with carefully groomed whiskers and an expression that strove for cordiality, but could not wholly conceal a nervous twitch about the mouth. He bowed with measured politeness, yet his eyes flickered uneasily to Holmes's face, as though already aware that here was a judge who would weigh him more severely than any shareholder. Holmes acknowledged the introduction with a courteous inclination of the head, but made no attempt at commonplace. Instead, his gaze swept the room, lingering upon the windows, the carpet near the desk, and finally upon a drawer that projected half an inch beyond its fellows. The clerks outside worked with heads bent low, but I knew they were straining to catch some hint of the drama within. An oppressive sense of scandal hovered in that quiet office, and it seemed to me that the very air trembled with suppressed whispers. Holmes advanced at once to the desk, his long fingers caressing its polished surface with the tenderness of a violinist touching his instrument. He bent low, peering into the narrow gap around the lock, and drew from his pocket the lens which so often transformed the invisible into evidence. "Observe, Watson," he said, his voice low but distinct. "The scratches are fresh. See how the lighter oak beneath contrasts with the darker polish. Yet they are not the marks of violence. They run parallel, shallow, as though made by one who possessed a key slightly ill-fitting, and who sought to disguise his usage. He traced the edge with his nail, then sniffed delicately. And here, a faint residue of cigar ash, Turkish blend of the most expensive sort. Do you perceive it? No? Yet it lies here, a grey whisper against the varnish. Such ash would never fall from Mr. Trent, whose habit against the hush. The odour of ink and leather-bound ledgers hung in the air, mingled with the faint polish of beeswax upon the panelled walls. Yet, beneath these familiar scents, there lingered something more elusive, as though the atmosphere had been charged by the presence of secrecy itself. I could not shake the feeling that invisible eyes watched us from the shadows of the tall bookcases, and that every polished surface reflected more than it showed. Even the clerks outside bent to their work with a strained intensity, as if fearful that one careless motion might betray their knowledge of the scandal hidden in their midst. I have stood in the tents of soldiers awaiting battle, and in sick rooms where the outcome of life or death hung on a single breath, but seldom had I felt so tangible an oppression as in that quiet office, where one locked drawer had unseated the bank's tranquillity. Holmes, who had been bending over the disputed drawer with lens in hand, suddenly gave a soft exclamation. He straightened and tapped with his finger a corner of the woodwork just above the lock. "Here, Watson," he said, "observe this dusting. To your eye it may seem a mere discoloration, but under the glass it is unmistakable. Tobacco ash, and not of any common sort. This is the delicate grey flake of a Turkish blend, Smyrna leaf of the most expensive variety. You will find it in but a handful of drawing rooms across London." I bent low, straining my eyes, but saw only the faintest smear, lighter than dust, upon the dark oak. "I should have sworn it was nothing," I confessed. "Precisely," said Holmes with a smile. "That is why it escaped the notice of others. But it betrays our man more surely than a signature. A thief of the common order smokes common tobacco. Here we have the indulgence of wealth or fastidious taste. That narrows our field considerably." Mr. Harwood shifted uneasily in his chair, while Trent's face grew yet paler. Holmes, however, turned away from them both, as though the tiny curl of ash absorbed him more than their reactions. To me, the discovery seemed to set a deeper chord of menace vibrating through the room, for it implied a culprit of influence rather than poverty. Holmes replaced his lens and stood with hands clasped behind his back, gazing out through the curtained window, as though he addressed no one in particular. "Gentlemen," he said softly, "this affair is not the petty tampering it has been taken for. We are faced not with a dismissed clerk nursing resentment, but with an adversary of position, one who moves with leisure, who can afford the choicest blends of tobacco, and who possesses the skill to open a drawer reputed impregnable." The words fell like stones into still water, sending ripples through the faces of those present. Mr. Harwood coughed, a short, forced sound. Trent pressed his handkerchief to his brow. Outside in the counting-house, I thought I detected the faint cessation of pens, as if even the clerks strained to hear the verdict from Baker Street's oracle. Holmes did not elaborate further. He merely allowed the silence to deepen until it became almost unbearable. And in that silence, I perceived the birth of suspicion, vague and dangerous, ready to settle where it would.
Our visit concluded with few formalities. Holmes offered no explanation, and the bank officials, cowed by his presence, dared not demand one. We passed once more through the echoing counting house, the clerks lowering their eyes as though afraid to meet ours. Outside in Lombard Street, the din of traffic came upon us like a sudden release. Holmes walked beside me in brooding silence, his head sunk forward, his brows drawn. I knew well enough that when he held his tongue thus, his mind was wrestling with some formidable discovery. To disturb him was futile, and so we went on our way, two figures amid the morning throng, carrying with us the shadow of a mystery that had grown darker rather than lighter within the walls of the bank. For some moments, Mr. Trent sat with lips compressed, as though the mere act of speech would betray a trust too sacred to utter. His eyes darted from Holmes to myself and back again, and it seemed that a battle was waged within him between faintest ripple in his impassive manner. Yet I saw his eyes flash with a keen light, and his fingers tighten slightly upon the arm of his chair. That brief spark of interest told me that, in his estimation, the case had risen several degrees in significance. I could not but recall what I had heard of Lady Evelyn in the drawing rooms of London, and in the society columns which occasionally came beneath my notice. Hers had been a meteoric ascent. The daughter of a baronet of modest means, she had captivated a wealthy landowner, and soon taken her place among the foremost hostesses of the capital. Her beauty was matched only by her skill in diplomacy, and more than one statesman owed to her a gentle word in the right quarter. Yet with such eminence came whispers, faint but persistent, of an earlier chapter in her life, an attachment to a young officer of no fortune, whose sudden disappearance from London coincided with her advantageous marriage. Such rumours had never been substantiated, and society, in its usual fashion, preferred to cloak scandal beneath admiration, so long as appearances remained unsullied. Still, I remembered that more than one tongue had hinted that her dazzling smile concealed a heart not wholly untroubled by the past. Now, to hear her name upon the lips of Mr. Trent in connection with stolen letters was to feel those whispers crystallize into a peril that threatened ruin not merely for herself, but for the fabric of respectability which society guarded so jealously. Holmes leaned back in his chair, his face composed, his lids half lowered over the steel-grey eyes that had already read so deeply into the matter. His voice, when he spoke, was characteristically cool. "Lady Evelyn Dorset," he repeated softly, as though testing the weight of the syllables. "A name of distinction, and of fragility. It is as I feared, Watson. The affair touches not only a bank, but a reputation. And reputations are delicate things, more easily shattered than jewels." He turned to Trent, whose hands were clenched tightly upon his knees. "You have been frank, sir, and that is well. Yet you will understand that by uttering this name, you have placed yourself in our absolute confidence. It is now my duty to act with all speed and caution. To delay may be to court irretrievable disaster." Though his tone was even, I detected in the narrowing of his eyes and the deliberate precision of his words a recognition that this case had assumed the proportions of something more than a theft. It was a drama poised upon the edge of scandal, where a single indiscretion might hurl a household into disgrace. Trent's pale features grew yet more haggard as he strove to make clear the peril. "You perceive, gentlemen, what this means. If those letters were to be revealed, if they were published, or placed in hostile hands, Lady Evelyn's name would be dragged through the mire. Her influence in society would vanish overnight. Her family, dependent upon her standing, would be undone. Even her husband, a man of honour, might find his own position intolerable." He passed a trembling hand across his brow. "I tell you frankly, the very existence of the bank is imperilled. Were it known that such papers had been entrusted to us, and stolen under our very roof, confidence would be shaken, deposits withdrawn, and ruin might follow. My own career too would be blasted, for it was by my oversight that the discovery was first made. I can neither protect my client nor defend my post. You see, then, why I came to you." Holmes regarded him with grave attention, his fingers tapping rhythmically upon the table. "Yes," he said slowly, "I see. The theft of money is but a passing inconvenience. The theft of reputation is a crime whose echoes reach the highest drawing rooms and the lowest alleys. We stand, Watson, upon the edge of a scandal which, if mishandled, may bring more wreckage than a dozen bankruptcies." And with that somber pronouncement, I felt the full weight of the case settle upon us. It has often struck me, in observing the affairs which crossed Holmes's path, how curiously fragile are the pillars upon which society rests. A man may labour for years to establish his household's name, and a woman may guard her dignity with ceaseless vigilance. Yet a single whisper
passed in Lady Evelyn's situation. I saw not only the peril of one woman, but the reflection of a system that demanded perfection, yet thrived upon gossip. I resolved inwardly that whatever my humble part might be, I should support Holmes in shielding her from a fate so unmerited and so merciless. Holmes broke in upon my reverie with a remark that bore the cold weight of fact. "A pistol, Watson, can silence one adversary, but a packet of letters may command an army of cowards, each trembling for his own secret. Blackmail is the subtlest of weapons, and, in its effects, more deadly than any bullet. It corrodes trust, paralyzes courage, and spreads fear like a contagion." His words, spoken in his low, measured tone, impressed me more deeply than the fiercest outburst could have done. He rose from his chair and paced the hearthrug with that quick, restless step which betrayed the stirrings of his mind. "This is no case of petty theft. Here we deal with a hand that understands the levers of society, one who seeks not gold, but dominion. To hold Lady Evelyn's honour is to hold a key to influence, perhaps even to fortune." He paused and stood before the window, gazing out into the fog that drifted past our Baker Street rooms. The smoke from his pipe curled upward in thin spirals, and the sharp outline of his profile seemed carved from stone. "No, Trent," he said quietly, turning back. "You did well to seek me out. The law may punish theft, but discretion is its enemy. Our work, therefore, lies in secrecy as well as in justice." I saw in his expression that resolute calm, which told me the case had passed beyond speculation and entered the realm of action. "Trent," said Holmes after a pause, "this matter cannot advance without the testimony of the lady herself. Hearsay and conjecture will not suffice. We must know precisely what letters were written, to whom, and what peril they contain. Only thus can we measure the strength of the weapon turned against her." The clerk started visibly. "But, sir, to approach her—" "Is unavoidable," Holmes interjected. "You may leave the details to me. Discretion shall be absolute. The lady must come to Baker Street, and she must come without delay. Inform her that unless I hear her own account, I cannot hope to guard her reputation." Trent bowed his head in reluctant assent. I could well imagine the difficulty of conveying such a summons, for Lady Evelyn was accustomed to courtiers, not to detectives. Yet Holmes's tone brooked no alternative. As our visitor departed, I caught a glimpse of the gravity on Holmes's face. "Watson," he said in a voice almost to himself, "when a woman of Lady Evelyn's station consents to meet us in secrecy, we shall know that the shadows of her past are darker than even Trent suspects." With that, he resumed his chair and struck a match to his pipe, the glow of the flame lighting eyes that already saw far beyond the rest of us. It was early the next morning when the familiar rattle of boots upon the stair and a brisk knock at our sitting-room door announced the entrance of Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard. He bustled in with the air of a man whose mind was already made up, his thin figure erect, his sharp eyes darting about the room as though to impress upon us that no corner could conceal a secret from him. His bow to Holmes was perfunctory, and to me he gave but a nod before seating himself uninvited upon the edge of our settee. There was in his manner a confidence bordering on triumph, and I divined at once that he came not to seek counsel, but to deliver judgment. Indeed, the very set of his mouth suggested a man already rehearsing the official report that would place another feather in his cap. "Well, Mr. Holmes," he began, rubbing his hands briskly, "your reputation may rest easy. For once, I believe the Yard is a step ahead of you." I saw the faintest flicker of amusement pass over Holmes's face as he leaned back in his chair, pipe in hand, and bade our visitor proceed. Access to duplicates in his day, and no doubt retained one. His dismissal, too, was for carelessness with figures, which indicates a reckless character quite capable of such folly. Add to this his straitened finances, and the case is as clear as daylight. He leaned forward, his narrow eyes glinting. The Yard will have him in custody within the week, and I dare say Lady Evelyn's letters will be recovered intact. It is a burglary, pure and simple, dressed in no grander colours than spite and opportunity. Though Lestrade's recital had the neatness of a puzzle box closed and latched, I found myself strangely dissatisfied. It was true that the explanation accounted for many outward features of the affair, yet it lacked, to my mind, the sinister weight which Holmes had so plainly intimated the night before. I recalled his words on the deadly nature of blackmail, the costly tobacco ash, and the ill-fitting key that spoke of deliberate artifice. None of these details sat easily with the portrait of a disgraced junior clerk acting on impulse. Moreover, Stillwell's disappearance, though convenient to the police theory, seemed to me suspicious in its very perfection, as if arranged to provide a scapegoat rather than to reveal a culprit. As I listened to Lestrade's confident tones, a chill of doubt ran through me. I could not shake the conviction that beneath this tidy picture lay a deeper design, one which only Holmes had glimpsed, and which would, in time, come to light. Holmes, for his part, received the inspector's exposition with a courtesy so marked that it verged on irony. He sat with his chin sunk upon his breast, his eyes half closed, emitting an occasional puff of smoke and a faint, non-committal murmur. At moments a slight smile played upon his lips, not of mockery but of quiet amusement, as though he watched a child constructing a card house, admirable in symmetry, yet doomed to topple at the slightest breath. "I congratulate you, Lestrade," he said once with grave politeness. "Your industry is as commendable as ever." The inspector swelled visibly at the praise and launched into a more detailed recital of the Yard's evidence, speaking of witnesses, clerk's testimonies, and the clerk's previous lapses. Through it all, Holmes listened with a patience most unlike his usual habit of swift contradiction. He gave no sign of dissent, and indeed his manner might have deceived an untrained observer into believing that he was convinced. But I, who had studied him too long, knew that his silence was the most ominous of all. It was the stillness of a mind busy with chains of reasoning, too intricate to reveal, and the faint gleam in his eye told me that, far from being satisfied, he was already shaping some conclusion which would render Lestrade's theory a mere footnote to the true account. With an air of triumph, Lestrade drew several objects from the leather case he carried and laid them upon our table, as though presenting trophies of the chase. First came a torn scrap of memorandum paper, stained at one corner with ink, which he declared had been found upon the floor near the disputed drawer. Next, he produced a small envelope, bearing no address, but marked with a greasy thumbprint. Finally, he flourished a dossier in which was recorded the disciplinary history of Edward Stillwell, the dismissed clerk, including sharp remarks by his superiors as to his negligence and insolence. "Each piece," Lestrade explained, "fits neatly with the rest. Here is the scrap, showing haste and untidiness, the very habits for which Stillwell was censured. Here the smudged envelope, bearing the mark of a man too careless even to wash his hands. And here the official record of his dismissal, ample motive for resentment. Taken together, the case is complete." He leaned back with a self-satisfied nod, while I examined the exhibits without conviction. The scrap seemed commonplace, the envelope no more damning than 1,000 others, and the record bore no direct link to the drawer. Yet Lestrade's confidence was unshaken, and I could not deny that, in the aggregate, His narrative had a persuasive ring. Holmes, who had watched the display with that faint smile which was more disconcerting than open laughter, now leaned forward and, with the utmost politeness, asked, "You will pardon me, Lestrade, but at what hour was this scrap discovered?" 10 o'clock. To manual labour in his youth. His hands would bear roughened skin. This print is smooth, almost delicate. A clerk of refinement, rather than a farm boy. The inspector shifted uneasily. "Well, be that as it may, he had the knowledge of the premises." "True," said Holmes softly. "But so, I think, had others." His eyes gleamed for a moment, then he leaned back, apparently content, leaving the silence heavy with the contradictions he had unveiled. Lestrade snapped his case shut with something of a flourish. "Well, Mr. Holmes, you may pursue your fancies, but the Yard works with facts. We have enough here to satisfy the magistrates, and that is what matters." Holmes bowed his head slightly, the ghost of a smile upon his lips. "Doubtless, doubtless," he murmured. "And yet, Watson, have you not observed how very obliging fortune has been in supplying just the clues required? When evidence fits too neatly, it sometimes betrays the hand that arranged it." The inspector rose in irritation. "You may spin your theories, Mr. Holmes, but the Yard prefers results." With that, he departed, his boots ringing angrily upon the stair. I turned to Holmes, but he was already lost in thought, gazing into the fire with eyes that burned more brightly than the coals themselves. "Far from settled, Watson," he said at last. "The real drama lies behind the curtain still, and it is there we must look." Holmes broke the silence after Lestrade's departure with a low chuckle, more thoughtful than amused. "Watson, it is fortunate for us that Scotland Yard leaves crumbs where it believes the loaf to be eaten. Lestrade has eyes only for the obvious. But there is another trail, faint, yet fresher than any the Yard has trodden." I pressed him for an explanation, but he merely held up a finger and went to the desk where the supposed evidence lay. With delicate precision, he examined the greasy envelope once more. "You note nothing, yet here, this faint impress of a cufflink." A man of fashion leant his wrist heavily upon the paper. Stillwell never owned such an ornament, nor could he have afforded one. Our quarry is no disgraced clerk, but someone of higher station, who brushed against the bait. His eyes glimmered with suppressed excitement. "Come, Watson. We shall follow this thread where it leads, for I have reason to believe it will guide us to a very different sort of lodging than Lestrade imagines." Without another word, he seized his hat and cane, and I followed, swept once more into the current of his unerring instinct. Our journey took us far from the dignified avenues of the West End into quarters less hospitable to respectability. The hansom rattled us over cobblestones slick with refuse, and the houses grew meaner with every turning. Windows sagged upon their frames. Children played barefoot in the gutters, and hawkers cried their wares in accents roughened by poverty. The air was thick with the odour of damp straw, gin shops, and frying fish. Holmes, ever alert, leaned forward, his keen gaze sweeping the signs above lodging-houses and pawnbrokers alike. "Note, Watson, how the criminal class gravitates," he murmured. "Here you see the boundary where wealth sends its discarded garments and men alike." I could not but contrast our surroundings with the opulence of Lombard Street and the threatened drawing-rooms of Lady Evelyn Dorset. Yet I knew from long acquaintance that it was precisely in such unlikely alleys that the faintest trace of truth might linger. At length, Holmes rapped sharply on the roof of the cab and bade the driver halt before a narrow building, whose shuttered windows and peeling paint gave little promise of welcome. "This," he said, stepping down, "is the place." The door was opened by a landlady of sharp aspect, her arms folded across a formidable bosom, her eyes narrowing with suspicion at the sight of two gentlemen. "Rooms are full," she declared flatly. Holmes, with that unfailing courtesy which so often disarmed hostility, raised his hat and replied, "We do not seek to take one, madam.
but to inquire about a recent lodger. A gentleman of refined habits, tall, with a taste for Turkish tobacco. Her expressions softened only a fraction. "I mind no such particulars." "We have many come and go." Holmes smiled faintly and, slipping a half-crown into her reluctant palm, added, "Then perhaps you recall the silver cufflink left upon your mantle, the one you were uncertain whether," he whispered. "The dust upon the floor shows where a trunk once stood, removed recently, for the dust is lighter there. The hearth is cold, yet the ashes are fresh, no more than 2 nights old. And here the faint reek of pomade upon the pillow. Our man values his toilette, even in flight. I noted too the half-burned scrap of paper in the grate, its writing charred, yet still bearing the flourish of a delicate hand. Holmes pocketed it with the utmost care. "A careless touch," he murmured. He wished to erase his past, yet fire does not always complete its task. The landlady fidgeted in the doorway, muttering about unpaid rent, but Holmes ignored her. His eyes gleamed as he surveyed the room, seeing in its barrenness not absence, but presence, the ghost of a fugitive whose identity, I knew, would soon be made manifest by my friend's inexorable logic. It was Holmes who, kneeling with lantern in hand, made the discovery that was to lend the case its most startling turn. He had drawn the rickety chest of drawers slightly from the wall, when something small and metallic rolled upon the bare floor with a faint clink. He stooped, retrieved it, and held it to the light. "Aha, Watson," he murmured. "Here lies the true signature of our lodger." In his palm rested a single cufflink, fashioned of solid silver, and gleaming even in the dingy half-light of that wretched chamber. Upon its broad surface was engraved an ornate crest, 2 rampant lions flanking a shield, above which rose a coronet. It was the work of a craftsman, costly in design, and altogether out of place amidst the peeling plaster and threadbare carpet of the lodging-house. Holmes turned it over with delicate fingers, his eyes alight with that peculiar flame of satisfaction which came to him only when his deductions received confirmation. "This, Watson, is not the ornament of a junior clerk. It speaks of wealth, breeding, and no small vanity. Our quarry is not among the dismissed of Lombard Street, but among those whose names are repeated in the clubs of St. James's." He slipped the cufflink into his pocket, his face grave but composed, as though the trinket were a key that unlocked a far more perilous chamber of the mystery. For my part, I confess I was struck dumb with astonishment. The sight of that elegant token, gleaming in such sordid surroundings, impressed me more than any words of Holmes could have done. It was as if a jewel had been dropped into the mire, proclaiming by its very incongruity that it belonged to a different world. I recalled Lady Eveline's name, whispered with dread in our sitting-room, and I felt that here, at last, was a tangible bridge between the world of scandalous whispers and the solid ground of evidence. The discovery of that cufflink suggested not a nameless thief, but a figure of standing, one whose very apparel betrayed his intimacy with the highest circles. "Holmes!" I exclaimed. "This alters everything!" He gave no reply beyond the faintest inclination of his head, but I could see that his silence was more eloquent than any declaration. The case, I felt, had shifted upon its axis, and we were now embarked upon a course which might bring us into conflict with powers far greater than we had yet imagined. Holmes, having secured the cufflink within his pocketbook, rose and brushed the dust from his knees with unhurried composure. His countenance, though calm, bore that look of suppressed triumph which I had seen on other occasions when his quarry had left behind a clue too telling to be overlooked. "Our friend," he said quietly, "was careless in his haste. Yet the carelessness betrays him more surely than if he had signed his name upon the wall. A silver cufflink with a crest is no article of the common man. It is a badge, Watson, as distinctive as a uniform. I could name 6 families in London who might claim such an ornament, and I think I know already to which hearth this one belongs." I pressed him for enlightenment, but he only smiled that inscrutable smile of his, the kind which closed my lips more effectively than any rebuke. Patience, my dear fellow. The time for names has not yet arrived. For the present, let us say only that our case leads us not downward into the depths of crime, but upward into the drawing rooms of the
Essential instructions. You will accompany me, Watson, and bring your revolver. Loaded, but held in reserve. Our work requires watchfulness rather than violence. I could not but admire his composure. There was no haste in his movements, no outward sign of tension, and yet I knew that every fibre of his keen intellect was strung for the contest. As the evening fell and the lamps of Baker Street glowed against the mist, I felt that old thrill of anticipation, which had so often preceded adventures in which I played the humble chronicler to his genius. We reached the city by cab, passing along streets already darkened, though the hour was early, for a fine drizzle had driven most citizens indoors. The great facade of the bank loomed solemn and silent, its doors closed to commerce, its lamps extinguished. Only a discreet signal from Mr. Trent secured us admission, and we stepped into a world curiously transformed. Gone was the clatter of pens and the low murmur of business. In its place hung a stillness, broken only by the echo of our own footsteps upon the marble floor. The air smelled faintly of ink and dust, yet without the bustle of clerks, the vast hall seemed cavernous, even spectral. The long counters and rows of ledgers were shrouded in shadow, and I could not shake the impression that the building itself held its breath in expectation. Holmes, striding at my side, cast only the briefest glance about him, before motioning us towards the private offices at the rear. He carried with him a small lantern, shaded to a mere slit of light, which he treated as though it were a weapon as dangerous as any blade. We took our station in a narrow alcove near the manager's office, a recess so placed that we could observe the drawer without being observed ourselves. Holmes had chosen it with the certainty of a strategist placing his men upon a battlefield. "Here," he whispered, "we command the only approach, and yet remain invisible." The darkness seemed almost tangible. Every sound, the rustle of my coat, the faint tap of Holmes's cane as he leaned it against the wall, was magnified to a startling degree. Even my own breathing struck me as perilously loud. Holmes, by contrast, appeared to merge with the shadow itself, his tall figure motionless, his face hidden, only the faint glimmer of his eyes betraying life. "Patience, Watson," he murmured once, scarcely more than a breath. "The fish will come to the bait." And then he was silent again, his hand resting lightly upon his pocket where, I suspected, lay that silver cufflink whose discovery had so altered the direction of the case. Never have I known time to drag more heavily than in that long vigil. The tick of a distant clock seemed unnaturally loud, and at intervals the ancient timbers of the building gave forth a groan or a sharp crack, as though protesting our intrusion. Shadows shifted with the flicker of our shaded lamp, and more than once I started at what I fancied to be the stealthy approach of footsteps, only to find it was but the sigh of wind beneath the doors. Holmes remained as immobile as carved stone, yet I knew from the faint tightening of his features that his mind registered each sound, each vibration of the boards. As the hours passed, my senses grew strained to the point of pain. Every creak seemed a herald of discovery, every silence a deeper abyss of suspense. Once, far off in the corridor, a floorboard gave a distinct complaint. I felt Holmes's hand close upon my sleeve like a vice. The faintest gleam of satisfaction touched his eyes. Whatever intruder we awaited was drawing near. And so we sat, breathless, while the silence deepened to its most oppressive weight, each second an eternity, until I felt that the very shadows about us were alive with menace. The silence was broken at last. From the far end of the corridor came the unmistakable tread of cautious footsteps, slow, deliberate, reckless youth driven by desperation. The bearing was too assured, the garments too neat. There was, even in that dimness, a suggestion of respectability ill-matched to such an hour and deed. I turned my eyes upon Holmes, but my companion remained still as stone, the faintest glimmer in his gaze telling me only that he saw all and missed nothing. The figure moved directly to the desk, wasting no time in searching elsewhere. With a key or some subtle instrument, he began to manipulate the lock of the drawer whose mystery had brought us here. His hand scarcely faltered. Each motion was precise, practiced, and disturbingly professional. The scrape of metal upon metal echoed like thunder to my heightened senses. I felt my pulse hammer in my ears, each beat mirroring the careful turns of his hand. At last there came a click so soft that I doubted my own hearing, and the drawer slid outward. For an instant, lamplight caught upon his features, just enough for me to note a brow knitted in concentration and a mouth compressed in silent determination. His hands, gloved though they were, betrayed haste now, as if greed or fear urged him on. He rifled among the contents with swift, eager fingers, searching for some particular packet or letter. Beside me, Holmes inclined his head ever so slightly, a gesture I recognized as one of satisfaction. I longed to spring forward, to seize the villain in the act, but Holmes's iron composure bound me in place. My suspense was intolerable. The drawer gaped open, its secrets exposed, while the intruder bent ever lower in his greedy examination. Every instinct of my soldier's training cried out to act, and yet Holmes's hand was upon my arm, firm, commanding, unyielding. "Not yet, Watson," he breathed, scarcely above a whisper. His eyes never left the shadowed figure. I felt the restrained power in his grasp, and I knew that to move before his signal would be to spoil whatever deeper plan he had so carefully conceived. And so I waited, breath caught, the revolver heavy in my hand, while Holmes' calm gaze fixed upon the intruder like a predator upon its prey. Then, at the precise instant when the thief drew forth a packet of letters, Holmes stepped forward. With a swift motion he threw back the shade of his lantern, flooding the office with sudden brilliance. "Your midnight labours are most industrious," said he, his voice cold and incisive. "Pray, do not let me disturb them." The intruder wheeled round, dazzled by the unexpected light, his gloved hand still clutching the incriminating bundle. And in that moment, the mask of secrecy was torn away, and the game was no longer his to play. The sudden blaze of Holmes's lantern was like a bolt of lightning cleaving the midnight gloom. The narrow office, so lately wrapped in shadows, leapt into pitiless clarity. The shelves with their ledgers, the heavy desk yawning open, and the intruder caught as if upon a stage, every feature betrayed by the unforgiving light. But what struck me most was not the act itself, nor the incriminating bundle clutched in the fellow's hand, but the incongruity of his appearance. For here was no shabby figure in rags, no furtive clerk red-handed in dishonesty, but a man of bearing and dress that bespoke respectability and authority. His frock coat was cut from the best cloth, his linen crisp, his cravat tied with studied care. He squinted against the glare, one hand raised as though to fend it off. Yet there was in his posture a curious blend of arrogance and alarm. Holmes, holding the lantern aloft like some judge with torch in hand, observed him with cold detachment. "So," said he, in a voice of silken steel, "it is not the errant underling but the master of the house himself." I could scarce believe my eyes, for the intruder thus revealed was none other than Mr. Harwood, the manager of the bank.
His features, so often seen by me in their accustomed dignity behind the counter, now appeared distorted by guilt and fury. "Good heavens, Holmes!" I exclaimed, unable to restrain myself.
"Sir, I was merely ensuring that our client's property remained safe from tampering."
Holmes allowed him his bluster, his expression as calm and unmoved as though he were studying a specimen beneath glass. "Safe," he said at last, his tone quiet but cutting. "You refer, no doubt, to the drawer which you yourself unlocked in the dead of night, and from which you extracted those letters still in your possession." Harwood shifted uneasily, his eyes darting from Holmes to myself, as though seeking in me a more sympathetic auditor. "I was testing the security. Yes, that is all. A manager must from time to time verify the precautions of his staff. I suspected negligence. It was my duty." "Your duty," said Holmes with the faintest of smiles, "is to guard your client's trust, not to rifle it." The pretense faltered. His voice grew hoarse. The composure crumbled. He stammered out a half-formed protest, but the look in Holmes's eyes silenced him more effectively than any argument. Holmes set down the lantern upon the desk and folded his arms. "Permit me to explain," said he, in that crisp tone which always heralded the laying bare of a mystery. "From the first, Mr. Harwood, your guilt proclaimed itself. The traces you believed invisible were to me as bold as the print in your ledgers." He raised a finger, as though enumerating each count of an indictment. "First, the ash upon the woodwork. Rare Turkish tobacco, not the common shag of a bank clerk, but a luxury suited to a man of means and taste. Second, the silver cufflink discovered in the lodgings you had taken under a false name, engraved with your family crest, an object no dismissed clerk could possibly claim. Third, the scratches upon the drawer. They bore no sign of forced entry by a stranger. Rather, they were the faint marks of a master key used repeatedly, with a hand practiced in its own lock." Harwood's lips moved, but no words emerged. Holmes concluded, his voice now edged with contempt. Thus, when Lestrade proclaimed that a disgruntled subordinate was the culprit, I held my peace. For the chain of evidence ran not downward to the dismissed, but upward to the very head of the establishment. You, sir, sought to turn confidential letters into instruments of blackmail, to wring from a lady her fortune and her honour. That is the true face of your midnight errand. The manager sank into the chair behind him, his bravado utterly spent. And, as I watched the proud man crumble beneath Holmes's remorseless logic, I felt the weight of scandal press heavily upon the room, more crushing than any physical blow. There are few sights more painful to the human heart than the spectacle of honour betrayed beneath the mask of respectability. As I gazed upon Mr. Harwood in the revealing glow of Holmes's lantern, the bitter irony pressed itself upon me with cruel force. Here was a man entrusted with the custody of fortunes, whose daily mien bespoke dignity and scruple, now laid bare as a villain gnawed by greed. How often, I reflected, had I observed this same paradox in the annals of our profession, the polished exterior concealing a festering corruption within. Yet, never had the contrast seemed sharper than in this instance, where the very guardian of a lady's confidence had become the instrument of her ruin. Holmes, meanwhile, regarded the man without pity, though without malice. His eyes burned with the cold flame of one who has pursued a line of reason to its inexorable end. And in that moment I understood that the true danger in such a case lay not in the theft itself, but in the weapon of scandal which Harwood sought to wield, a weapon more devastating than any blade or bullet. Holmes leaned forward, his voice quiet yet cutting. "You would, perhaps, still protest innocence, Mr. Harwood, were it not for the tokens you left in your wake. Permit me to place them before you." From his pocket he drew a neat bundle, which I recognized at once. The stolen letters, bound together with a faded ribbon. "These," Holmes continued, "were not removed for safe keeping, as you claim, but concealed for future use. Their contents, as you well know, touch closely upon Lady Evelyn Dorset's reputation. In less scrupulous hands, and beneath it there lay only the visage of the blackmailer." For a time he sat rigid,
his fingers clenching and unclenching the edge of the desk, as though still grasping at defiance. Then, with a sudden shudder, the strength drained from him. He sank heavily into his chair, his face buried in his hands, the lines of pride and command dissolving into those of a broken man. "It is useless," he muttered hoarsely. "You have me fast." The silence that followed was heavy with shame, broken only by the faint ticking of the clock upon the wall. To me it seemed that in that instant, the once formidable manager, aged 10 years, crushed, not merely by Holmes's logic, but by the consciousness of his own fall. Holmes drew himself upright. "I anticipated this moment," said he calmly, "and therefore summoned Inspector Lestrade, who waits even now below." At his signal, the familiar figure of the Scotland Yard man entered, his keen eyes alight with the satisfaction of official triumph. Without further ceremony, Harwood was placed under arrest, his feeble protestations brushed aside. As the sound of retreating footsteps echoed down the stair, Holmes replaced the lantern upon the desk and turned to me. "Another mask removed, Watson," he said. "Another reminder that crime often wears the most respectable of faces." It was in our familiar sitting room at Baker Street that the matter reached its inevitable denouement. The storm outside rattled faintly against the windows, but within, the glow of the fire lent a peculiar solemnity to the circle that had gathered. Holmes sat upright in his armchair, pipe in hand, his hawk-like profile illuminated by the lamplight. Opposite him sat Lady Evelyn Dorset, pale yet composed, her gloved hands clasped tightly together. Inspector Lestrade, with the air of one who has been both confounded and enlightened, leaned forward eagerly, while I myself occupied my customary seat beside the hearth. The sense of expectation was palpable. "It is time," Holmes said at last, "that the curtain be drawn from this little drama. We are now in possession of all its threads, and it only remains for me to show how they were interwoven. You will observe, Lady Evelyn, that the danger which so gravely threatened you has been averted." Her ladyship inclined her head, though I saw the flicker of apprehension in her eyes, as though even the relief of exposure carried its own torment. Holmes leaned back, his gaze fixed upon the ceiling, as if retracing each step of his thought. "From the first," said he, "I was ill at ease with the tale of a dismissed clerk. It was too pat, too readily supplied. True crimes, Dr. Watson, are rarely so considerate as to arrange their own explanations." He tapped the stem of his pipe thoughtfully against the mantel. "The drawer, you recall, had been opened without violence, and yet only the letters of Lady Evelyn were removed. No coin, no securities, no items of general value were touched. That suggested not burglary for gain, but theft with a very pointed object. The motive, therefore, must be sought not in poverty, but in leverage." Lady Evelyn's colour deepened at this remark, but Holmes's tone remained neutral, as though discussing a point of chemistry rather than human frailty. "Thus," he continued, "the spectre of blackmail rose before me, and the supposed dismissed clerk began at once to fade into the shadows." Holmes's eyes brightened as he recounted this clue. It was, however, a faint trace that spoke with greatest clarity. On the ledge of the drawer there lay, scarcely visible to the naked eye, a particle of ash. To most it would have passed unnoticed, but to me, well, Watson, you know my monograph on the subject. Lestrade gave a half-grunt, half-laugh, which Holmes ignored. It was no common shag or cheap Virginia. This ash was of the finest Turkish cigar, a brand retailed in but 2 establishments in London, at a cost far beyond the purse of a disgruntled clerk. Only a man of established means would indulge in such an article, and moreover, would do so with the carelessness of long habit. He turned to Lestrade. "Does it not follow, then, that our quarry was no impoverished servant?" Astonishment, Holmes turned the object delicately between his fingers. Here, engraved upon its face, is a crest of no obscure design, but belonging to a family of standing well known in financial circles. Only one man in our tale could possess it, Mr. Harwood, the manager himself. When joined to the rare ash and the too precise selection of the stolen items, the chain was complete. Lestrade shifted uneasily, as though feeling the sting of his own misjudgment. Holmes, however, spared him no reproach. Instead, he addressed Lady Evelyn with a quiet dignity. Thus, the hand that should have guarded your honour sought to profit from its betrayal. Happily, the plot is disarmed, and justice will proceed without further scandal to your name. Her ladyship bowed her head, tears glistening in her eyes, while Holmes rose and placed the cufflink back into his desk, with a gesture that seemed to close the case as firmly as any verdict. Holmes leaned forward, drawing from his pocket a small magnifying lens, which he had used earlier in the bank office. "Consider, if you will," said he, "the so-called evidence of forced entry. These scratches upon the brass plate of the drawer, when examined, reveal a curious uniformity. They are not the hurried marks of a burglar's tool, but the deliberate mimicry of such." He placed the lens in my hand, and I saw, to my astonishment, that the lines ran parallel, as if guided rather than struck in desperation. "The man who made them," Holmes continued, "possessed the key. He turned it, opened the lock without resistance, and then, with a clumsy hand, sought to imitate the signs of a burglar's labour. But note, true tampering leaves chaos, jagged cuts, and uneven strain. These were carefully arranged scratches, intended to deceive Lady Evelyn. Her face, half hidden by her veil, uttered a faint gasp. Lestrade frowned deeply, muttering something about over-ingenuity, though he could not hide the grudging respect in his glance. "The lock told me," Holmes said calmly, "that the intruder was not an outsider forcing entry, but an insider staging it." From that moment, Mr. Harwood stood before me as the most likely culprit. Holmes lit his pipe, the faint spiral of smoke wreathing upwards as he continued. The web was neatly woven. The dismissed clerk, embittered and familiar with the premises, provided a convenient scapegoat. A few scraps of paper bearing his hand, a smudge upon the desk, and whispers amongst the staff were enough to direct suspicion. He turned his keen gaze upon Lestrade. "You, Inspector, were expected to seize upon that trail, and indeed, you did so with commendable vigour. But you were following a path deliberately laid for you." Lestrade shifted uneasily, though to his credit he made no protest. Holmes's voice grew colder. Harwood calculated that once the police pursued the dismissed man, he might retain his plunder in safety. The letters, kept hidden, would form his instrument of power. With them he could coerce Lady Evelyn to silence, or to terms of his choosing, without ever soiling his public respectability. At this, Lady Evelyn's gloved hand trembled visibly, and I marvelled again at the audacity of the banker's scheme. Built upon duplicity and founded upon a reputation so carefully maintained in society. But, Holmes concluded, even the most artful deceiver commits his misstep. Harwood's lay in his vanity, the belief that he must revisit the scene, to assure himself that no trace betrayed him. In returning by night to adjust the drawer, he sealed his fate. He might have slumbered secure had he trusted his first artifice. But the criminal is ever a creature of restlessness. I recalled vividly the oppressive silence of that midnight vigil, the sudden footfall, the stealthy hand upon the lock. Now it was plain to me that his confidence was not born of boldness, but of familiarity. He moved through those offices as master, not as intruder. Holmes set down his pipe and looked across the room. That, Lady Evelyn, was his undoing. Had he remained away, suspicion might still have clung to the poor clerk, but in seeking too perfect a deception, he brought himself within my lan. "Be done. Let my name be shielded." If this matter were to reach the ears of society, I should be undone. Her eyes glistened, and for an instant I glimpsed not the grand lady of London salons, but a woman cornered by fear. Holmes inclined his head with grave courtesy. "You may speak with frankness here, Lady Eveline," said he. "Dr. Watson and I are bound to you in discretion." She sank into a chair, her hands clasped tightly upon her lap, and after a moment's struggle began to speak. "In my youth," she whispered, "I was indiscreet. Letters were written, unguarded words, confessions of sentiment that, though long since buried, could, if made public, be twisted into scandal. My husband, now gone, knew nothing of them. My children, who move among the highest circles, would be crushed beneath the shame." Her voice wavered, and she covered her face for a moment before continuing. "Society is merciless, Dr. Watson. A single whisper is enough to poison a reputation. An unveiled letter would destroy it. Wealth, charity, position, these are but fragile defences against the cruelty of gossip. Were those letters to find their way into the wrong hands, I should be branded forever." Holmes listened without interruption, his expression unreadable. Yet I observed that his fingers tapped lightly upon the arm of his chair, a sign I had learned to associate with the gravity of his thought. I confess that my heart was moved. In the practice of medicine, I had seen many forms of suffering, but few struck me as so cruel as the invisible lash of society's scorn. Lady Eveline, for all her wealth and station, sat before us like a prisoner awaiting sentence. The knowledge that a folly of youth might now blight the happiness of her later years roused in me a profound compassion. I could not but reflect upon the harshness of our times, in which a man's lapses are so often forgiven, while a woman's are preserved as eternal indictment. The trembling of her hands, the shadow in her eyes, spoke of a torment that no tribunal could match. I glanced towards Holmes, silently hoping that his formidable intellect might serve her not only in unmasking guilt, but in shielding her honour. Holmes at length broke the silence. His voice was calm, yet carried with it a firmness that seemed to steady her nerves. "Lady Eveline, you have my assurance. The law has its due, and Mr. Harwood will answer for his offence. Yet as to your reputation, rest easy. Not a breath of this matter shall escape these walls, save in such form as preserves your dignity." She raised her eyes to his with a look of mingled relief and disbelief. "You mean—" "I mean," Holmes replied, "that the letters shall be restored to you, untouched and unseen. The criminal has been unmasked, and justice will be satisfied. But the secret of your past will remain where it belongs, in silence." A sob, half gratitude and half release, escaped her. She pressed Holmes's hand fervently before rising. "You have given me back my life, Mr. Holmes," she murmured. Holmes inclined his head, and as she departed I caught the faintest gleam in his eye, the satisfaction not of triumph, but of duty fulfilled. It was with evident discomfort that Inspector Lestrade confronted the turn which the case had taken. He had been quick to celebrate Harwood's arrest, for nothing so pleases the official mind as a matter neatly tied and docketed. Yet the suggestion that Lady Eveline's name should be excised from all mention of the affair struck at the very marrow of his professional conscience. "I must say, Mr. Holmes," said he, shifting uneasily in his chair, "the Yard cannot be in the habit of suppressing evidence or altering its records. A case is a case, and the law knows no distinction of rank." Holmes, who was replenishing his pipe with the calmness of a man dictating the rhythm of the room, replied without raising his eyes, "And yet, Inspector, the law is but a means, not an end. Its purpose is the preservation of order, not the destruction of reputations where no public good can come of it. In this instance, the guilty party is secured, his crime demonstrable by evidence of an unimpeachable character. But the name of his intended victim mingling with tears in her eyes. Lestrade muttered his assent, though his voice carried the reluctant tone of a man yielding more to Holmes's authority than to his own conviction. For myself, I added warmly, I pledge it. Holmes inclined his head gravely. Then it is sealed. Dr. Watson, whose pen is often the historian of my cases, will respect the discretion required. Inspector Lestrade will see that no mention of Lady Evelyn appears in the Yard's reports, and Lady Evelyn, for her part, will accept this protection as both shield and burden, shielding her from calumny, yet burdening her with the knowledge of what might have been. The silence that followed was heavy, but dignified, as though an oath had been taken before some higher tribunal. When at last Lady Evelyn departed, escorted by her maid, I found myself unusually moved. Many times had I witnessed Holmes mete out justice with the sharp edge of logic, sparing neither the great nor the humble. Yet here, in this rare act of compassion, he had tempered justice with mercy. To the world at large, the case would appear a simple one, a bank manager unmasked in his crime and duly punished. But to those of us within the circle of Baker Street, its true lesson lay deeper, that reputation, once stained, may never be cleansed, and that to protect it where innocence remains is no less noble than to punish guilt. I looked across at my friend, who sat with his eyes half closed, the faint wreath of smoke rising from his pipe. There was in his face no triumph, only a quiet composure that seemed to say he had chosen the harder, yet the better path. And I thought to myself that the rarest victories of Sherlock Holmes were not those of intellect alone, but of the humanity that occasionally shone through the steel of his reason. The carriage that bore us back from our nocturnal labours rattled over the uneven stones of London with a sound that seemed doubly harsh after the tense stillness of the bank. Lady Evelyn had departed with her maid, and Lestrade had returned to Scotland Yard, leaving Holmes and myself alone with the aftermath of the affair. Holmes leaned back against the cushions, his eyes half closed, his long fingers steepled before him in that attitude which bespoke reflection rather than fatigue. I ventured no remark, for I knew that speech at such times would be intrusive. The only sound was the clatter of wheels and the occasional cry of a costermonger lingering late in the street. When at length we reached Baker Street, I felt, as I had so often done before, the peculiar solace of our rooms. The glow of the lamps, the littered tables, the familiar odour of tobacco smoke, all formed a welcome contrast to the dark and sordid passions we had just left behind. Here was order after chaos, companionship after peril, the hearth after the storm. Once within doors, Holmes cast aside his coat and threw himself into his armchair, the firelight throwing strong shadows upon his ascetic features. His violin lay upon the table, though he made no move to touch it, and his pipe, though ready, remained unlit for several minutes. I had come to recognize such silences as the intervals during which his mind disentangled itself from the threads of one case before fastening upon another. Yet there was in his expression a weight not always present, a brooding cast which suggested that his thoughts were not upon the evidence alone, but upon the human drama it concealed. At last he reached for his pipe, and the familiar wreaths of smoke began to curl above his head. Still he spoke not a word, and the crackle of the fire seemed louder for his silence. To me it appeared that his eyes were fixed not upon the hearth, but upon some inner vision, as though he gazed into the very heart of the matter we had laid bare. It was not in my nature to disturb his meditations, yet the oppressive stillness grew upon me until I could bear it no longer. "Holmes," I said quietly, "you have carried us once more to a successful conclusion.
Yet I fancy that the case has impressed you in a manner deeper than usual. May I ask what thought so occupies you?" He removed the pipe from his lips and regarded me with a faint smile. "Your perception does you credit, Watson. Indeed, this case has been less a battle of wits than a glimpse into the frailty of human lives. I have been pondering, not outwardly secure, yet containing letters, tokens, or memories that, if once revealed, may wreck the edifice of a reputation. Harwood sought to exploit such a drawer, and in doing so, unmasked the hidden weakness of us all. The very semblance of security invites temptation to those who pry." He tapped the ash from his pipe and continued more softly. "It is not always crime that compels me, but the fragility of the human condition. A scrap of paper, a careless phrase, a half-forgotten folly. These can outweigh in terror the heaviest of crimes. I confess, Watson, that I find it a sobering thought."
The fire sank lower upon the hearth, and his features softened into repose. I made no reply, for there seemed nothing to add. Closing my journal for the night, I reflected that while Holmes delighted in the triumph of reason, he was not insensible to the burden of secrecy that lay at the heart of human nature. And so ended the curious case of the locked drawer, whose mystery, though solved, left behind an echo more haunting than the crime itself. Holmes sat motionless for some minutes, the glow of the fire striking sharply across his angular features, before speaking in that low, deliberate tone which seemed always to issue from the very centre of his reasoning powers. "Watson," said he, "have you observed how jealously the world guards the mask of respectability? It is an idol before which wealth, title, and influence are daily sacrificed. Yet behind the mask, behind it, how often one finds only weakness, folly, and fear." He drew thoughtfully upon his pipe, and a slow wreath of smoke drifted upwards like a veil. "Lady Evelyn's predicament is but a sharper instance of what I have seen 100 times. Men labour a lifetime for position, women for esteem, and yet a scrap of paper or an indiscreet whisper may undo all. Society exacts a price, not for the crime itself, but for the revelation of it. Hence the drawer locked in secrecy, the cupboard wherein skeletons are hidden." There was in his tone no harshness, rather a detached melancholy, as of one who recognized that the very fabric of civilization was woven from such contradictions. "It is curious," he added, "that truth, which ought to be liberating, is often treated as the most dangerous of intruders." His words lingered in the room long after they had been spoken. I confess they stirred in me a compassion deeper than any professional habit of sympathy. Lady Evelyn had sinned no more gravely than many another, yet society, with its merciless appetite for scandal, would have shown her none of the tolerance granted to men of equal guilt. I looked upon Holmes with renewed admiration. He, whose reputation for cold precision had so often disguised his more generous impulses, had chosen mercy above triumph. He might have exposed her folly, paraded his deduction, for I felt that this adventure had touched not only the intellect but the heart. The contrast between the brilliance of Holmes's reasoning and the quiet humanity of his resolution impressed me with a force I could scarcely express. At length I closed the volume, the faint snap of its clasp sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet room. Holmes did not stir, nor turn his gaze from the fire. To him, perhaps, the case was already consigned to the past, another problem solved and put aside. Yet to me, it remained vivid. A reminder that beneath the austere exterior of my friend, there dwelt not only the keenest of minds, but a rare understanding of the fragile secrets hidden in the locked drawers of the human soul. Holmes leaned back in his chair, pipe in hand, eyes fixed upon the dying embers of the fire. "Watson," he said softly, "tonight we have seen how the smallest of traces, a wisp of ash, a solitary cufflink, can unravel the grandest of schemes.
Crime often wears the guise of simplicity, yet it is human weakness, impatience, or vanity that betrays the culprit. The lesson, my dear friend, is that the apparent security of a locked drawer or a carefully guarded secret is no match for careful observation and steady reasoning. Which moment do you think ultimately led the manager to his undoing? The subtle clue of the ash, the silver cufflink, or his own overconfidence in revisiting the drawer? Share your thoughts in the comments, discuss your deductions, and be sure to subscribe for more tales of Holmes's extraordinary reasoning. Don't forget to share this story with fellow lovers of mystery and intrigue.